This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression President Greg Lukianoff discusses his book, The Canceling of the American Mind. He argues that the right to free speech is being threatened by cancel culture. He's interviewed by Reason Magazine's Matt Welch.
We assume you're here because you enjoy listening to C-SPAN's podcast. If you're a regular listener, please consider supporting our nonprofit operations so we can continue to bring you quality public affairs podcasts like these. Visit cspan.org/donate to learn more.
It's been 5 years since you co-wrote with Jonathan Haidt, The Coddling of the American Mind. And since then, there's been quite a number of books to come out talking about free speech, the rise of illiberalism in places where free speech is supposed to reign on campus, journalism, companies, and et cetera. What motivated you to write this 5 years later, and how is the canceling of the American mind different than what else we see out there?
Yeah. So, I've been defending free speech on college campuses for 22 years. I'm a First Amendment specialized attorney who's also specialized in academic freedom for years now. And I had an opportunity to write a follow-up to Coddling the American Mind that could be really interesting because we discovered this amazingly brilliant, 20-year-old named Rikki Schlott. She's a Gen Z young woman. She actually is a huge fan of Coddling the American Mind, and she came to both me and Haidt to say, listen, I dropped out of school during COVID because I saw all the problems that you were talking about. And I wanted to, write about the themes in coddling. So she was such a great writer, we immediately made her a Fire Fellow. And when after I was a year of working with her, I was so impressed. I'm like, we should write a follow-up to Coddling the American Mind and it will add the insights of a Gen Z young woman, which is great because Coddling the American Mind was so much about Gen Z young women. But as we were getting ready, I couldn't believe that I was still seeing people really staking their entire reputations on the idea that cancel culture was a hoax or didn't even happen. And I can tell you from working on campuses this long, it didn't just happen. It's the kind of thing they're going to be studying in 50 to 100 years, just like we study the Red Scare today. So I was finally like, okay, that's it. I've had it. Like, I'm going to put this all in one book. I'm going to make three primary points. One, cancel culture is real. It's happening on a historic scale. And by the way, we take on both left and right, which is very important to a lot of people. The middle part is basically about reconceptualizing how you think about cancel culture. To think about it as only the most extreme way of winning arguments without winning arguments. That essentially, rather than persuade somebody, we've learned this very junior high school-like tactic, which, by the way, I argue that it does in some ways come from junior high school, but I can get into that later, to just scare people out of disagreeing with you or ruin their lives if they do. And the third part is us beginning the process of trying to find a way out of this madness and trying to really make people understand that cancel culture isn't just about the more than 1,000 professors who have been targeted, for example. It's about what it does to trust and expertise. Because if you see that, for example, Carol Hooven at Harvard, who was started to be forced out initially by a DEI administrator, for going on Fox News to talk about her book, and she said she made the point that we should be kind to transgender people. We should be we should use their pronouns. But as the author of a book on testosterone and an evolutionary biologist, we have to recognize that biological sex is real and it matters scientifically. And that led to a whole campaign against her at Harvard. Now, and she got extremely depressed, and she's now leaving Harvard. Now, that's sad all by itself. That's cancel culture. That's illiberal all by itself. But what does that do to people's faith and expertise on this topic? Because the public isn't stupid. And looking at a situation where, like, even at Harvard, someone's making, a very modest point that nobody disagreed with up until very recently can be targeted and forced out of their job. Why should I believe anybody on this topic anymore? Because I now know that to say anything other than the approved line can get you canceled even at Harvard. So I think people really need to get that cancel culture is much more devastating to our shared world of facts than people understand.
We are saddled with that term, cancel culture, which you acknowledge and everyone else acknowledges is just there, for lack of a better term. So let's realize it and talk about it. What is your working definition of it? and explain briefly, perhaps, to those skeptics, those people who have been, as you say in the book, gaslighting about cancel culture, that it exists. What's the documentary evidence, perhaps with comparatives to aforementioned Red Scare and such?
Sure, absolutely. So our definition is a historical one. We're trying to make an argument for thinking of cancel culture as a specific historical era. And that's partially from the fact that as a First Amendment lawyer who's very interested in the history of censorship, the moments of what I call mass censorship incidents all have names. You know, the Sedition Act of 1798, of course, is the easiest one. The Victorian Age, probably the longest one. The first Red Scare, which is actually only a couple of years, and Red Scare II, which is 11 years, and also known as McCarthyism. We have all of these terms to describe moments when lots of people start losing their jobs or otherwise are targeted for their speech. And we talk about, and part of our definition is for speech that would be protected under the First Amendment. What we mean by that, which we explain in an appendix because we don't want to bog the book down too much, is as an analogy to public employee law, a way to bring in a great deal of nuance and common sense to a definition about when we think it's not canceling to fire somebody and when we believe it very much is. And we also talk about cancel culture being the culture of fear that resulted from this situation of people losing their jobs for their opinions. Now, when it comes to the data, I mean, as I just mentioned, we know we're only seeing a tiny fraction of this. And I'll give a point of comparison. I started my job around 9/11. Actually, I landed in Philadelphia to find an apartment to start my new job at Fire on 9:10 a.m. on 9/11. So all of my first cases were defending professors who said things about the attacks, including the very first letter I ever wrote was a defense of a professor who joked that anyone who can blow up the Pentagon has my vote. And this was considered to be a very bad attack on academic freedom. And at the time, it certainly felt like it was. And I defended more left-leaning professors and more right-leaning professors in different cases who got in trouble for kind of different things. There was another professor, Mike Adams, who we talk about in the book, who got in trouble for actually criticizing a student who said America has had the attacks coming on a giant listserv on campus. So looking at the data, there were about 17 professors targeted. That's bad. That's a large number of professors in a normal historical year, certainly since the law was established between 1957 and 1973. This is considered a historic moment. And 3 professors were fired. All 3 of which, by the way, of whom, were fired for reasons that don't actually implicate academic freedom. Ward Churchill, a name you might remember, he was fired for gross academic misconduct, which was real. Samuel Arian, who was my first time defending him, was on TV. He was eventually fired not for his speech, but for ties to international terrorism. And the third one was for not actually teaching her class, rather giving an extended lecture on something completely unrelated to it, which they can, frankly, fire you for. So three firings, considered a big deal over the course of years. I'm now talking about an era in which there have been, we know for a fact, we know that the numbers are much larger than this, there have been 1,000 targetings of professors, with about 2/3 of them resulting in some kind of punishment, 2/3. And nearly 200 of them, at least through last July, were fired, with I think 40 plus tenured professors being fired. That's the standard number for McCarthyism before the law existed, by the way, before people knew you couldn't actually just fire communist professors for being excessively ideological. That didn't happen until 1957. So McCarthyism was 1947 to 1957. The standard at the time, the biggest study that they did of McCarthyism at the time, and of course we're still in cancel culture, was they found something like 62 or 63 professors fired for communist beliefs, about 90 professors fired for beliefs overall, and it usually is rounded up to about 100 being the standard estimate. I think with time we can now say that there are probably more than that, but again, we should be counting the counting that they did at the time because we're still in the middle of this thing. So you're talking about 3 times as many communists as they believe were fired. You're talking about twice as many as the standard evidence of McCarthyism. And we also know this is an undercount because 1 in 6, and I really want to stress this, 1 in 6 professors say that they have been either threatened with investigation for their academic freedom or actually investigated. And about 9% of students say that they've been investigated. And one more detail. About 9% of during McCarthyism, the same study talked to thousands of professors, and they found that about 9% of them were saying that they were self-censoring. That's really bad, to be clear. 1 in 10 people self-censoring on campus is really bad. And when we did our own polling on this, and these aren't exact comparisons because we also asked them, like, do you self-censor on social media, which didn't exist at the time, but we found that the number was closer to 90% today. So I think that at this point, if you're saying that cancel culture doesn't exist, you're being willfully blind. And I've watched, and this is kind of like my big ideological test. When I mention the fact that 1/3 of those punishments initially start from activism on the right, sometimes Turning Point USA, a conservative organization that has something called the Professor Watch List, sometimes Fox News, for example, that about 1/3 of those punishments initially come from the right. And if that suddenly makes people take this issue more seriously, I immediately take them less seriously, because I'm politically left of center myself, but you have to care about people you don't agree with getting censored, not because it could be you next, but because it's wrong.
We're talking about academia here, and FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, only recently rebranded to Expression. Before it was Education. So you worked on campus issues for a long time. And in many ways, this begins, the laboratory is the campus, and then it jumps the banks and goes into journalism, it goes into science, goes into psychotherapy, which hopefully we'll talk about a little bit later, which is crazy.
That was the most depressing chapter to research.
But what is your working theory? Let's stay with academia just for the moment before we go on to the other ones. What is your working theory for why it exploded so much in 2014 in academia, and what were the sort of mechanisms with which or by which it exploded?
Yeah, why 2014 is a question we get a lot. And one reason why we didn't spend too much time trying to answer that in Canceling is we spent the entire book, my book with Jonathan Haidt, A Coddling of the American Mind, explaining why we think the students who were hitting campus around 2014 were so different. And by the way, that's partially the answer, is that Gen Z started hitting campus, and if you follow sort of cancel culture, you saw a lot of professors getting in trouble, a lot of students getting in trouble, demand for new speech codes in 2014, and it wasn't subtle. It was something that was very noticeable at the time. And then you start seeing sort of corporate cancel culture as these students start graduating and moving on into jobs. And that's one of the reasons why it was so helpful to write with a 23-year-old, this brilliant Ricky Schlott. She pointed out, that, we talk about cancel culture beginning in 2014, but I grew up with this. This was the way we fought in junior high school. This is the way, like I mentioned before. And the thing that really changed the social dynamic, which we talk a lot about in Coddling the American Mind, but take somewhat for granted in Canceling of the American Mind, is social media. And I know that people are tired of hearing that social media changed the world, but I try to, give a sort of historical explanation of why you can't, you have to take this seriously as a major shift for the, I'm going to say it, the species. And here's why. As a First Amendment lawyer, and this is how much of a nerd I am for this stuff, I took every class that Stanford offered on First Amendment. I interned at the ACLU of Northern California, and then when I ran out of classes, I did 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty. And the reason why there was this explosion of censorship under the Tudor dynasty is because of the original disruptive technology, the printing press. And people, we think about all the benefits the printing press gave us, and over the long term, it absolutely did. It was transformative. There could have been no scientific revolution without it. There could have been no American or French Revolution without it. But in the short term, it led to an increase in the witch trials because the bestseller was the book about how to identify a witch. It led to, of course, gross civil unrest. It led to religious wars. It has a lot of blood on its hands. And in the 1520s and 1530s, Henry VIII tried to put the genie back in the bottle to make this thing more or less go away. And spoiler, he failed. Now, that was just a situation in which you introduced several million people into the global conversation. Social media has done something that's we've never even come vaguely close to. We added at least an extra billion people into the global conversation. And there is no way to escape that without it being incredibly disruptive. So the way it actually turned into cancel culture in some ways is humbler in the sense that, or actually, Tumblr plays a role as well, and not to make a joke there, but that a lot of these norms for how you, frankly, kind of bully each other or fight it out in junior high school, they were things that were refined on smaller social media platforms, and then they were kind of a normal part of Gen Z life by the time they actually got to higher ed. So social media is ultimately, the reason why a lot of these trends sped up, and it also created new trends like I just said, Tumblr, or the right-wing version of it, 4chan. All of these kind of nasty environments where people battle it out for social status using words alone. But why was higher ed so vulnerable to this? And the reason why higher ed was so vulnerable to this is both natural forces, more or less, that essentially, as higher ed had less and less viewpoint diversity, as it became more monolithically left-leaning, and that applies to both professors, and even more so, by the way, to the ranks of administrators who have swollen over the past several decades. As viewpoint diversity went down, that it shouldn't be a surprise that when people are in power, they start seeing free speech as part of the problem, because if there's going to be censorship, it's going to be them doing them. So it's a very normal temptation of power to become kind of pro-censorship once you are in power. But that's the natural fact, that essentially if you don't have enough heterogeneity in your group, there's a tendency, as my co-author Jonathan Haidt likes to say, to sacralize your beliefs, to treat them very much like religious beliefs and to protect them. But that's the unintentional part. I want to be very clear, though. There's been a very intentional plan to turn academia and even the left against free speech going back to 1965. And we point at Herbert Marcuse as being kind of the pioneer of this, as a Marxist, at the same time critical of Marxism, but wanted to follow the vision. He was still a big fan of Mao, for example, in the 1970s, which is not saying a great thing. He wrote an article, and he was considered the guru of the New Left, a very influential guy. He wrote a article in 1965 called Repressive Tolerance, which is very explicit on the idea that he believes to have a truly free and equal society, we need to repress the bad guys. Who are the bad guys? The so-called right wing, the so-called conservatives. So I had to go back and read it to remember. It's very much a call for we should have free speech, the good guys, which basically means like his illiberal version of the left as opposed to my, more libertarian version of the left. They should have free speech, but they need, in order to make their utopia, dictatorial powers to punish the speech of people who are they deem regressive and right wing. So. And the torch was picked up on this by people like Richard Delgado, Mary Matsuda, the original people who started the School of Critical Theory in law schools. And this led very quickly, just 20 years after the beginning of the free speech movement in 1964, it led to speech codes being passed on college campuses, which really started to come into their own in 1985. So by 1985, and you already have universities adopting speech codes, and it's very intentional to limitations on freedom of speech. The Words That Wounds article came out in 1980. And it was by 1989 you start having legal challenges to it. And from 1989 to 1995, all of these codes are defeated in court. Everybody thinks, political correctness was this crazy thing and it's gone away. And thank goodness, because the professors and the students got less enamored with enlightened censorship. I think a lot more kids of the boomers started hitting college, and they were actually pretty good on free speech. But the problem was that there wasn't any serious reform that took place after 1995. There was just a sense that the problem had somehow taken care of itself. And what happened after that, and I wrote about this in Reason magazine, the first great age of political correctness, which is 1985 to 1995, since it was met with public scorn, and since the speech codes were defeated, people thought, oh, thank goodness that's over. But what actually happened was the administrative class in universities hung on to these ideas. And by the time I started at FIRE in 2001, about something like 79% of colleges had what we call red light speech codes. So even though they're defeated in court, we found that schools all over the country had speech codes that were identical to the ones defeated between 1985 and 1985 and 1995. So I felt like I spent a lot of my career trying to warn people that there's something bad coming here. There are really troubling attitudes about freedom of speech that exist in higher ed among administrators, and that are also filtering down to K through 12 through education schools, and that we're eventually going to be paying for this. To be honest, I thought when I wrote my short book Freedom from Speech in 2014 that payback might be in the distant future, and I've been only shocked to discover that it happened a lot faster than I ever expected. So I think that higher ed was uniquely primed for cancel culture. I think it's done a really poor job of teaching people how to, argue fairly or how to win arguments by actually persuasion, for example. And so it's not a shock that things got much worse there first. What is a little shocking is how bad it got in say, like the last 6 years.
You referenced DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in academia, which also go pretty heavily down through K through 12. Use that as a way to get into other areas of science, of journalism, of even COVID, if that applies, how DEI has been part of the story of spreading cancel culture.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of these things where it's a great marketing coup to have diversity, equity, and inclusion in your name. And people, including me, are inclined to like that. That sounds swell. But unfortunately, the way DEI is interpreted and the way it's often meant on campus is actually a bundle of very specific assumptions about human nature, about group identity, all of these kind of things. And it's something that we've seen DEI administrators come up in case after case that we've seen at FIRE. Including, I was the person who videotaped when Nicholas Christakis was surrounded by angry students and being shouted at Yale, and I videotaped it to show that he held himself incredibly calmly, because I knew at that point from having enough experience on campus that if it actually turned into a he said she said between Christakis and the student group, he'd be out of a job. So I needed to show that at the time. What I didn't know was that there were 3 DEI administrators in that group. They weren't shouting, but they were there and not actually reining the students in. The Carol Hooven case started by a DEI administrator. The case at Stanford Law School, which just embarrassed me to death, it has a whole chapter devoted to it. This is a case where a Fifth Circuit judge, a conservative Fifth Circuit judge, to be clear, a Trump appointee, was invited to speak at Stanford Law School. Now, I want to stress here, there's nothing weird about conservative judges speaking at Stanford. It happens all the time. But in this case, administrators met with angry students about Kyle Duncan speaking at Stanford. They met with them for hours. Then suddenly, when he shows up, there's an angry mob there. Right before he talks, someone shouts to him, "I hope your daughters get raped." And there's a 10-minute shout down, and by the way, precisely 10-minute shout down, before he talks. And then this administrator who hadn't introduced herself before, Tyrion Steinbach, gets up, and she reads from a prepared speech. She has prepared a speech, a 7-minute long speech, about whether or not the juice of free speech is worth the squeeze. I know that sounds weird, but she repeats is the juice worth the squeeze? She also makes the point that, she sort of targets the professor, the judge as well, saying, think of all the pain you've caused by being here, and is the juice of that pain worth the squeeze of having you here? And it's like, this is a law school, and this is a Fifth Circuit judge. He's one step below the Supreme Court. That's kind of a big deal. And then as soon as she leaves, it turns into just nonstop heckling, but they let him get some words in response. It's generally just a very, ugly situation overall. We cover it, we give it its own entire chapter to illustrate our larger point that cancel culture is just one way of winning arguments without winning arguments. Because we point out all these other very academic tactics to never actually address the meaning of what somebody says. Now, the most disturbing thing to come out of the DEI movement on campus are DEI statements, requiring DEI statements to be admitted to school in the first place, to get, in order to be admitted to graduate school, in order to attend conferences at this point, in order to participate in any number of things that scholars have always participated in. You need to actually do your DEI statement. And last time I checked, something like 50% of large schools already do this, and it's heading more towards like 75%. And here's why you should be concerned. We have a chapter called the Conformity Gauntlet that I'd like that if you do read just one chapter, that's probably the one you should read, because most of you listening to this, I don't think I have to convince you that there's no way to make something like a DEI statement not a political litmus test. That basically that is asking you to state your politics and then to see if we approve of this. But for those of you who are skeptical and need convincing, Nate Honeycutt, who back while he was out of college but now has since become a FIRE fellow, did an experiment where he tried different kinds of DEI statements. He found something like 3,500 professors to evaluate these 5 different kinds of DEI statements. They evaluated one that was about class, lack of class diversity in higher ed, something very dear to my heart, something I take very seriously, and I think is actually the most serious diversity lacking, and particularly in elite higher ed. They talked about religious diversity, viewpoint diversity, and the final one would be one that could be described as, and I don't really love this term, woke, basically saying all the things that, the very rigid ideas of identity and what they mean and intersectionality. And the only one that would have actually gotten you admitted by the standards of this experiment was, of course, the one that was parroting the exact ideology they wanted to hear. All these other ones that sometimes they claim is, you can say whatever you want in a diversity equity statement. No, you can't. And the viewpoint diversity one wouldn't have gotten you in. The religious one definitely wouldn't have. And even the socioeconomic one, which did a little bit better, just a tiny bit, was still not considered the right answer. So the idea that you have this little viewpoint diversity in higher ed to begin with, and then you add a political litmus test on top of it is crazy.
We've spent some time talking about kind of left of center or left-directed censoriousness. You talk in your discussion about the culture of free speech broadly. 2 different types of rhetorical fortresses.
Yes.
In your view, the efficient rhetorical fortress coming from the right and the perfect rhetorical fortress coming from the left. I would invite you to maybe talk about the efficient a little bit.
Sure.
But first, as just a setup, what do the 2 have in common? What are they doing, and therefore we are all doing, regardless of whether we haven't set foot on a college campus since 1990? What are we all kind of either witnessing or taking part of in the way that we just have normal arguments and debates?
Yeah. This was actually something, to the extent to which I was writing a book about a lot of depressing examples, the part where I got to have at least some fun was to talk about my observations and my and Ricky observations of the way we argue and how dysfunctional it is. So we start out with the tactics that both sides use, and we dub the first one the obstacle course, which are standard logical fallacies. Things that everyone does more or less just to win arguments cheaply. Including, for example, accusations of bad faith, which is, calling someone a grifter, for example. And we call that the obstacle course. Then you go to the minefield, which are also tactics that the right and left use. And the one that's become the most relevant lately is what we dubbed hypocrisy projection. And this is something we see all the time at FIRE. Someone who only cares about censorship when it's directed at the left or the right, when they see us take a case on the left or the right and announce it on Twitter, immediately, sometimes in all caps, where is FIRE on this case? And it's always someone who only cares about one side, but they expect you to be hypocritical and only defend the side they don't like. So it's projecting their own hypocrisy is what we mean by it. But the funny thing about this is time and time again, it is someone who doesn't realize that we were on that case sometimes weeks before. And I remember actually probably my favorite example of this was someone asking, where's FIRE on this case that they assumed we wouldn't be involved in? And the thing he was linking to was actually a FIRE document that was only made public because of FIRE. We've had people do this when it's kind of like, dude, the thing you're linking to, we're quoted 3 inches down. Like we're in that already. So hypocrisy projection, when you start looking for it, is everywhere. And the right and left do it. We have this this case, like right now, involving whether or not you can de-recognize Students for Justice in Palestine. And of course, the argument against Students for Justice in Palestine is made in Florida and by Brandeis University, is that they're materially supporting terrorism. Now, if they can prove that Students for Justice in Palestine is materially supporting terrorism, by all means, like that's a felony, and people would be and indeed probably should be arrested for that. But given that they're mostly pointing to hortatory language in the policies of Students for Justice in Palestine that encourages members to think of themselves as part of the pro-Palestinian resistance. Just hortatory language, that's not enough to match the very, very serious claim of material support for terrorism. And someone, wrote something immediately from the right, being very angry at us, like, "Where were you when Ayaan Hirsi Ali got disinvited from Brandeis?" Now, what's funny about that is that was 2014. So that was a long time ago. So for most other people, would have been like, "Oh, I was in junior high school, but I'm an old man." So I was like, here's the article I wrote in the Huffington Post about that in 2014. One of the reasons probably why you know about that incident.
You referenced Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who's running for president, has made fighting back against woke and fighting back against kind of the preponderance of university academia-based censoriousness and DEI policies, kind of central to at least some of his national political ambitions, and he's been part of passing and signing into laws there. People who support him, and sometimes he himself, will say, look, you kind of have to fight fire with fire, to use a terrible term given who we're talking to here, but we're showing the left, we're using the left's own tools against them, because what choice do we have? There's only one conservative for 5 trillion left of center academic administrators.
That's a precise number, by the way.
I think so. I saw that in the Appendix D in your book. But what do you say to that argument? Because it is on the rise, and it's particularly on the rise, I think, post-October 7th, the Hamas massacre in Israel, where there's been a lot of tumult on college campuses, including the Palestinian student organizations. So what do you say to that overall approach? Where is it wrong, or is it wrong?
Yeah, I have lots of responses to that. And one of them is that I take a backseat to no one on advocating for higher ed reform. I've been doing that for 22 years, probably more, since even before I started at FIRE. I've written about this recently in the National Review. I've written about it on my Substack, The Eternally Radical Idea, about big ideas, because I think higher ed has just gotten way too expensive. Like, even that fact alone, like how much the idea that they try to argue with a straight face that it costs $70,000 for tuition, but that only covers half the cost of educating a single student. If you're saying that we can't educate students for less than $140,000 a year, we've done something terribly wrong. And that's even before you get to the ideology, the lack of viewpoint diversity, the lack of due process, and free speech. But when I look at the attempts to rein in higher ed, some of them I have no issue with. And there have been some of them saying, like, there was a law in North Carolina basically saying you can't compel people to say things they don't believe, and that's actually a great First Amendment value. That's actually well established. There's been other ones that try to decrease the number of DEI administrators or administrators overall, and I make the point that even though people have objected to that, I'm saying you need to understand that in some cases, not all, of course, but in some cases, DEI administrators are a threat to free speech and academic freedom on campus. I gave three examples before, and there's countless more. But if you're going to go after the curriculum in higher ed, then we have a problem. Because that's unconstitutional, and you don't want the government actually deciding for higher ed, like, what their curriculum needs to be. And so when this law came out, and just to also address a stereotype that sometimes I see on the left, is there's an idea that there's been this massive curricular attack on higher ed. There has been one law passed, the Stop Woke Act in Florida, that threatens the curriculum on campus. Fire and the ACLU, separate lawsuits, we challenged it, we defeated it. And by the way, we gave perfect warning to Florida saying, this is unconstitutional. Actually, I went so far as to say, this is laughably unconstitutional. If you care about higher ed reform, first thing you got to do is pass something legal, for goodness sakes. So we sued for it, we defeated it. They've rewritten the Stop Woke Act a little bit. It's still unconstitutional, and we will be challenging it again. But here's the problem. It set back the reform movement tremendously. It took huge energy away from it, and now basically people are kind of trying to paint everything with the brush that it's trying to be the Stop Woke Act. Again, like I said, there's been one law, and that's really bad. But so far, for now, it's actually been defeated. So I think actually that effort has set back much needed reform that could otherwise already be happening.
Talk about how cancel culture, or just the bad way we now argue, has affected psychology of all damn things.
Oh, man. Yeah, this one really gets to me. So we wrote about trends in psychology, and the thing that led me to writing Coddling the American Mind was my own struggles with depression. I was hospitalized as a danger to myself in 2007, and because of that, everybody who fights this stuff who pays a psychological cost, contacts me to tell them how exhausting they find this stuff. So practically everyone I know needs either needs therapy or is getting it in some way. And having some contacts who are actually in psychology programs and meeting more through the Fire Student Conference, which is something we do in Philadelphia every summer, which is amazing. We learned that in clinical psychology programs, they're really telling psychologists psychotherapists to intervene when they hear wrongthink from their patients. And I don't know if this is everywhere, but I've heard it enough. It shouldn't be anywhere, essentially. And I've heard also that students are painting at length about what to do if it turns out, God forbid, they should treat someone who turns out to be a Republican, or even worse, a Trump supporter. I'm a Democrat myself, but the idea that what should a psychologist do, a psychotherapist do when they find out that their patient is actually more conservative? They should treat them compassionately and try to help them, not correct their beliefs. And so that was one of the most disturbing chapters that we wrote. As far as something that could be an incredibly depressing follow-up to Canceling the American Mind, that could easily be expanded into its own book all by itself. Because I think about what would have happened to me if in 2007 since I was one of the reasons I got so depressed was because of the culture war, and it was exhausting. And my left-leaning girlfriend hated me when I took cases on the right, and my right-leaning folks that I would meet at a bar would want to punch me, literally. I nearly got in 2 fights because I defended people who said insensitive stuff, directed at the right. And it was exhausting. And if I had showed up when I was when I was actually contemplating suicide, and my shrink actually tried to correct my beliefs about the world to tell me it didn't really look that way, I don't know if I'd still be here.
Talk a little bit about what happens to trust when supposedly or aspirationally neutral people, institutions especially, are seen to weigh in very heavily on one side of this and use some of these tactics that you talk about and criticize in the book.
Yeah, we have a whole chapter on what COVID did to trust and expertise. And in that case, we give the example, we give actually many examples, but one of the most vivid examples is Jennifer Say. And she was an executive at Levi's. She was, potentially going to be was in line potentially to be the future president of Levi's. And she was well-known as an advocate for the rights of K through 12 students, particularly minority K through 12 students. Both her kids, I believe, were biracial. And when the lockdowns happened in 2020, she made this argument. This is going to be really bad for kids, whatever its result for the spread. This is really going to harm kids, and it's going to harm the most vulnerable kids the most. And for this, it was treated as if she had said something blasphemous. And remember, how the ideology that I believe was already there just felt so so tense in 2020. And so there was a whole campaign to get her to apologize, to take it back, to acknowledge her privilege, and eventually they offered her a severance package, which she didn't take because she wanted to be able to tell her story. Now, it's a bad story for someone to be forced out for saying something that's just their opinion, period, even if they happen to be wrong. But it's now pretty much the consensus that, yeah, regardless of anything else, there was serious harms to young kids, particularly minority kids, for not having face-to-face schooling for such a long time. So, and every time when people act like we know way more than we actually do, and in this case, there was this kind of dead certainty that lockdowns were good, and they couldn't, and if you think they could be harmful to kids, don't say that at all, or face the possibility of getting canceled, just like Jennifer Say did. When you create that kind of environment of certainty, people kind of call your bluff. I thought the same thing that happened when early on in COVID, the first couple people who started saying, there's a virology lab in Wuhan that's about respiratory viruses. Maybe this was a lab leak. And the problem is, I don't know if the lab leak is true. Nobody knows if the lab leak is true. But what I do know is that my friends, my highly educated friends who suddenly came in and said, well, that's ridiculous, we know that it came from a wet market, were deluding themselves. Because it's like, what? There's been some massive investigation of Wuhan? How did the Chinese government let us do that? That's amazing. Wow, I guess we finally know this. But again, people aren't stupid, and they look at that going, listen, I don't know if this is true, but I know you don't know this is true, and you shouldn't be actually going after people's careers with this level of certainty. So I think that a lot of the COVID mistakes came from not leveling with the public about what is known and unknown, but instead acting like we had a much greater level of knowledge than we did, is devastating to trust and expertise. And we need experts we can trust.
The flip side of that is, as you document in the book, is that it becomes very, very easy for those who are anti-establishment or who bang the drum about the untrustworthiness of those supposedly neutral institutions to dismiss whole swaths of people. Talk about that dynamic a little bit and how it relates to Donald Trump, frankly.
Sure, yeah. We talk about the two different rhetorical fortresses, and they're the styles for winning arguments without winning arguments that are specific to the left and the right. I talked about the ones that were both sides, but the perfect is Byzantine and wonderful because it's kind of a structure of beauty because it was more developed in academia, so a lot more twists and turns. We call the efficient rhetorical fortress on the right because it's just very simple and straightforward. It's more of a talk radio kind of idea. You don't have to listen to anybody you can dub a liberal or woke. You don't have to listen to anybody who is a journalist, even if they're conservative. You don't have to listen to experts. And we make a point that sometimes the experts don't do themselves any favors, but if you have a general rule about never listening to experts, that's a problem. And of course, for the most aggressive on the right, anybody who dismisses Donald Trump. I think people will be surprised to find out that we get more hate mail for coddling the American mind by orders of magnitude from people who thought we were not fair to Donald Trump in our explanation of Charlottesville. We actually, Haidt and I wrote like a whole response to this about why, no, actually we were right on this. And on the right, it can be incredibly easy to dismiss people that way. And that chapter was very interesting because we listed a lot of the times that Trump wanted to get particular journalists fired. One of the most fun cases, though, and I just did her show as well, most fun, of course, by that I mean interesting. Megyn Kelly was lucky enough to actually be canceled by the right for being too hard on Trump, and by the left for saying that when she was a kid, people putting on blackface for Halloween was comparatively normal. So we have three chapters on book challenges / book bans. We have another chapter on and those are legislative attempts. So not technically our definition of cancel culture, but we thought important enough to cover. And then we talk about attacks on the media, and we give a lot of examples of that coming from Trump. But we also talk about this movement that you mentioned earlier on the right that is not a libertarian right, but a more common good, common good politics. I forget exactly what they call it.
Yeah.
But this idea that essentially free speech, a lot of these small L liberal ideas are actually part of the problem, and that essentially a much stronger governmental hand is what's needed, but a more explicitly conservative governmental hand, and that scares me. I think I'm with a lot of Americans, particularly in the center left and center right. I like liberalism, small L liberalism. I like the vote. I like democracy. I like diversity, and I think some of the trends that I'm seeing on the right, largely, to be fair, in response in many cases to some of the stuff they see in the left. This is always a what we call it is a polarization spiral. That there's no politics in a vacuum. The right does something, it pisses off the left gets more extreme, rinse, repeat, as we talked a little bit about in coddling as well. And one of the things that we're trying to do in the book that is perhaps more ambitious than could ever be realized, but is to call out these lousy ways of arguing just in hopes that we could use this extra billion eyes on these problems to solve problems rather than cancel people and repost cat videos.
Let's apply some of your frameworks and insight analysis to events that have taken place since the book has been published, or at least since you haven't been able to correct it or anything. Most notably is post-October 7th, massacre there. One thing that we've seen a lot of is posters being put up, college campuses around town, New York City, elsewhere, and then torn down. And then people are filming some of the people tearing down the posters and saying, and then the people tearing down the posters being filmed, saying you can't film me. Help us think about this through the terms of cancel culture.
Yeah, this one's tough because when it's someone who... So there's a case involving, I think his first name is Michael Eisen, who retweeted a article from The Onion, and the satire was that it was regretful that a dying Palestinian boy's last words wasn't condemning Hamas. Like it was a very sharp-edged kind of criticism of the way we talk about what's going on in Israel since the attacks, and that was the final straw that led him to be fired. That is absolutely within our definition of cancel culture. And of course, people since have argued, well, there were more reasons than that. And I'm like, they always say there are more reasons than that. There very well might have been. But if the straw that broke the camel's back was retweeting The Onion, that's cancel culture, absolutely. When it comes to the tearing down of posters of kidnapped children and elderly people and friends and family, that's something that is tough, partially because it is itself illiberalism. It is intolerance itself. So you can't say that there's some kind of special free speech value in tearing down other people's posters. That's mob censorship. That's private censorship, trying to actually literally limit the spread of true facts. So I have very limited sympathy for the people who tear down the posters. The only sympathy that I do have is, and it can only be patronizing to some degree, which is they grew up in environments where being pro-Palestinian was so automatic that essentially they don't want to even have to look at something that problematizes that issue. And the other part of sympathy that I have is that once you actually put someone on video, you can start getting. Unfortunately, it's something that all of us who are in the public view, I get them. You get death threats, and if you're a woman, you tend to get rape threats. It's truly awful. But here's something very strange that's coming from campus that I would like to call out. There's this idea that students, particularly in higher ed, have a kind of quasi-right not to be videotaped or not to be shown or to have their names out there. It's a special kind of like bubble idea of a right in higher education that I think is not, well, for one thing, it's not doxing. Doxing, by the way, has no meaningful legal no meaningful legal definition. But generally, it's revealing someone's home address, which, by the way, is legal, but I do think it's not something you should do, or revealing someone's a private phone number, which again, legal, but something that I think is worthy of criticism. But just showing someone's face is unavoidable. And this actually happened in the Stanford case. This happened at Yale. There was an argument that essentially, well, because the response to this bad behavior is going to be so bad we can't actually show the students, and that's a special exception that nobody else gets. And oftentimes the students who are doing the shouting are actually the ones who would be very happy to reveal everybody that they're opposed to. So does this mean I'm being callous about the then threats against them? Absolutely not. As a First Amendment lawyer, one thing that sometimes people think that as a First Amendment lawyer, you think there should be no exceptions to the First Amendment. I think that's nonsensical. There's no such thing as a true free speech absolutist. I actually think the exceptions that we have in the law make a great deal of sense. Including threats doctrine. And I actually think that we've done the First Amendment no favors by not actually investigating true threats of harm or death on social media, for example, because it leads people to think, wow, free speech sucks because I can be targeted. I can even be, people can threaten to rape me and terrify me, and apparently that's protected. Well, I'm here to say that's not protected, and nor should it be, and it should be investigated and punished. So when it comes to the potential downstream harm of having your face out there for doing something that's, morally reproachable, then you have to focus on the people doing the threatening. You have to focus on the people doing the harassing and doing the stalking. But it can't be the answer that you simply can't put up pictures of people doing things that are themselves extremely illiberal.
What say you to, for example, there's been quite a trend of big figure donors to Harvard, to the University of Pennsylvania in particular, but other places as well, since October 7th, saying we don't want to send our money to these little anti-Semitic hate factories. And in one case in the University of Pennsylvania, they were referring specifically to the unsavory, from their point of view, invitees to a Palestinian Writers Festival. Yeah. How is that looked at through the prism of cancel culture if I am not going to stroke that $50 million check to Penn because they are platforming Palestinians?
So, on the one hand, donors can do whatever they want with their money. On the other, if they're demanding that programming be stopped or faculty or students get punished for, to be clear, clearly protected speech as opposed to threats or discriminatory harassment, etc., we have a problem with that, and we will object to that loudly. And once the student or faculty member, gets punished, then that's very much a fire case. On the other hand, I can't say that it would be the worst thing in the world if a lot of these major donors stopped giving huge amounts of money to these incredibly wealthy and powerful institutions. I mean, Harvard has $50 billion to one side. That's its rainy day fund. And the idea that people keep giving these huge grants to it, it enables cancel culture. It's one of the reasons why universities can not really care about public pressure. Can completely, like Harvard, until Harvard ranked dead last in our campus free speech ranking, which is based on 13 different factors, not something that we put. We didn't have any say in where they ended up in the end. Harvard always ignored us, no matter how bad the case that we were fighting, and they suddenly started taking us seriously. But I do think if donors start saying, "Listen, I'm walking entirely, and I'm giving my money to the campus free speech rating, at FIRE, or the University of Austin, the new experimental liberal arts college," I think we'd be living in a healthier country. I also have some sympathy for this scenario. After the Hamas attacks, I know a lot of these university presidents, knowing what they actually think, are pro-Israel, and they were horrified, like all of us were, by the brutality of the Hamas terrorist attacks. And I know a lot of them actually would have said something very condemning if they weren't afraid of their own students, faculty, and administrators. And that's cancel culture itself. John Haidt wrote something pointing out that some of the distortion, some of the weirdness you're seeing on campus is coming from cancel culture itself. It also, I think, is one of the reasons why some of the students on the Harvard letter were so sure that it wouldn't be that controversial to, on the day that the attacks are still happening, to say this is entirely Israel's fault. So when donors are actually saying, say something you don't believe as a public statement, I have an issue with that. I think that's an inappropriate use of power. But when they're saying, say something you actually believe, you coward, I do have some sympathy for that. But I really do think that the best thing that can come out of this is people be aware that Harvard, Penn, and Harvard, Penn, Yale. These are all schools that do terribly in our free speech ranking, and I think that the only way they're going to learn is if people stop applying and stop giving massive amounts of money to it. In that same survey, the biggest survey ever conducted, by the way, 55,000 students polled, 4 biggest databases on student cancellations, professor cancellations, speech codes, and deplatforming, that elite colleges did abysmally. Actually, only technically we actually used abysmally as a term, so only Harvard ranked technically abysmally. But UVA and University of Chicago did pretty well. But I think taking your money, putting it in more experimental ways to do higher education, cheaper ways of doing higher education is a good way to go. And I think that also being aware of these lesser-known, usually technological colleges that actually have great records on free speech, where students say you can disagree productively, sending your kids there instead of just expecting them to be the 16th generation of Harvard graduate, I think that would be a good outcome for all of us.
One of the interesting things about your co-author, Ricky Schlott, is that she's from Gen Z.
Yeah.
And Gen Z turns out to be, at least preliminarily, surprisingly resilient when it comes to free speech and cancel culture. A little bit different than the millennials above them. Talk about that in the waning 2 or 3 minutes we have here.
Yeah, one of the interesting things to learn is that the population that hates cancel culture the most, it's not boomers, it's not Gen X, the best generation, of course. And it's definitely not millennials. Millennials have the biggest, unfortunately, that stereotype is true. As far as like anti-free speech views, millennials do the worst of any group by far. But Gen Z hates cancel culture the most. They grew up with it. They're sick of it. They don't like it. They don't want this to keep going. And that does give me at least a little bit of hope.
Give us a few tools, Greg, if you will, as we're walking out the door here. How do we train ourselves to be better at arguing and to not fall for the kind of rhetorical traps and shortcuts, though, attempts to sort of wave away entire swaths of people so as not to have to argue with them?
Well, we have a lot of suggestions on thefire.org. We also on the Eternally Radical Idea, my Substack. But the most basic principles, the good news is they're ones that Americans already know. And they are reflected in idioms that were very popular when the two of us were kids, but Ricky, my co-author, had basically never heard. I mean, she'd heard of them maybe in passing. To each their own. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. Walk a mile in a man's shoes. Don't judge a book by its cover. These are all small L liberal ideas, small D democratic ideals that should be back in circulation as a way of checking yourself. To say, who am I to cancel this person when I know that that in the grand scheme of things, I'm just someone with an opinion that might ultimately be wrong.
The book is The Canceling of the American Mind. The authors, Greg Lukianoff and Ricky Schlott. Greg, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Afterwards podcast. We want to make sure you know about our latest podcast, Books That Shaped America. It's a companion podcast to our 10-week television series of the same name. We've teamed up with the Library of Congress and selected 10 books from across American history that have had a major impact on our society. Each week, the C-SPAN television program will focus on one of these books and its impact. This companion podcast will give you more background on the book's authors. If you want to learn more about Books That Shaped America, go to our website, c-span.org. The podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts.